What if some of the most dangerous ideas in history were not weapons, but thoughts? Over the centuries, philosophers and thinkers have created theories capable of challenging morality, breaking beliefs apart, and changing the course of entire civilizations. Some argue that fear is more powerful than kindness. Others claim that there is no right or wrong, that life has no purpose, or that freedom itself can become a form of prison. In this video, you will discover 15 philosophies that continue to spark debates, influence leaders, and disturb millions of people to this day. Some may sound absurd. Others may make more sense than you would like to admit. The question is, are you ready to question everything you have always believed? When people talk about Niccolò Machiavelli, few phrases are as well known as the idea that the ends justify the means. Interestingly, this exact sentence never actually appears in his most famous work, The Prince. Still, it became a popular way to sum up Machiavelli's thinking. But did he really believe that any action, no matter how cruel or dishonest, was acceptable as long as it led to success? Or has his philosophy been simplified over the centuries? To answer that, we need to look at the context in which he wrote. Machiavelli lived in a divided Italy, marked by constant wars, political betrayals, and conflicts between city-states. Rulers were easily overthrown, alliances changed overnight, and stability was rare. In this environment, he wasn't writing about an ideal world, but about the world as it actually was. The Prince, published in 1532 after his death, came directly from this observation of reality. Instead of describing how a ruler should act based on the moral or religious ideals of the time, Machiavelli asked a much more uncomfortable question. What does a ruler need to do to gain and keep power? This shift in perspective was revolutionary. For centuries, many thinkers believed politics should follow high moral principles. Machiavelli broke with that tradition by separating private morality from political action. According to him, a prince who insisted on always acting with kindness, honesty, and mercy could end up destroyed by enemies who did not share those same values. In other words, ruling required seeing human nature as it is, not as we wish it to be. In one of the most famous passages of The Prince, Machiavelli states that people forget the death of their father more quickly than the loss of their property. This may sound extreme, but it shows his deeply realistic view of human interests. For him, people are often driven by fear, ambition, and self-interest. A leader who ignores this would be building their rule on illusions. Instead of relying only on people's goodwill, he believed it was necessary to understand their real motivations. This is where one of the most controversial ideas in Machiavelli's philosophy appears. He argues that, in certain situations, a ruler may need to use lies, manipulation, or even violence to preserve the stability of the state. This did not mean these actions were morally good. It only meant that, in the face of certain threats, they could be politically necessary. For him, a failed ruler could throw an entire society into chaos, civil war, or foreign invasion. Because of this, protecting the state was seen as more important than individual virtue. This idea is famously expressed in his advice that a prince should learn to act both as a lion and as a fox. The lion represents strength, used to intimidate enemies. The fox represents cleverness, needed to recognize traps and avoid them. Relying only on strength would be naive. Relying only on intelligence would also be insufficient. An effective ruler would need both, and the ability to know when to use each one. But here is a detail that is often ignored. Machiavelli was not teaching people in general how to manipulate others for personal gain. His focus was the survival of the state. Throughout The Prince, he shows constant concern with political stability, public order, and the safety of the population. When his ideas are taken out of this context, they can sound like a justification for acting without limits. However, within his logic, the central issue was never the ruler's personal benefit, but the protection of society as a whole against real threats. Still, this way of thinking raises a moral dilemma that remains very relevant today. How far can a leader go in sacrificing ethics for the sake of a greater good? Imagine a leader hiding information to prevent panic during a crisis, or a government taking extremely harsh measures to avoid a national collapse. These decisions might protect millions of people, but they can also open the door to abuse of power. Where does political necessity end and tyranny begin? Machiavelli never gave a simple answer to that question, and that is part of why it still matters. Because of this, many scholars argue that Machiavelli was not a defender of cruelty, but an observer of political reality. He described systems of power that already existed long before him. His originality was in abandoning idealism and analyzing political behavior without illusions. In a way, he did for politics what a doctor does for disease. He does not create it. He studies it to understand how it works. This intellectual honesty is exactly what makes The Prince so unsettling. The book forces readers to recognize that power and morality do not always go hand in hand. Throughout history, many leaders gained authority using methods that would be condemned in private life. At the same time, highly virtuous rulers who could not deal with ruthless opponents often lost their kingdoms and left their people in even worse situations. Machiavelli challenges readers to face this contradiction without easy answers. His influence went far beyond politics, reaching fields such as business, diplomacy, strategy, and leadership. The term Machiavellian came to describe people who are manipulative, calculating, and cold. However, this association does not always do justice to his work. Reducing Machiavelli to a simple advocate of manipulation ignores the complexity of his thinking. His real interest was in understanding how power works, showing that effective leaders often must make difficult, unpopular, and morally ambiguous decisions. Perhaps Machiavelli's greatest lesson is this: understanding power does not mean approving of it. Studying his ideas does not turn someone into a manipulative person, just as studying war does not make someone want war. On the contrary, knowing these dynamics helps us recognize them when they appear in politics, organizations, and even personal relationships. After all, those who understand how power works are less likely to be easily deceived. And this is the question that still remains more than 500 years after The Prince was written. If you were faced with a decision that could save thousands of lives, but required you to abandon your moral principles, what would you do? Is there a limit that should never be crossed, or do certain situations truly change the rules of the game? This debate continues to divide philosophers, leaders, and ordinary people to this day, showing that Machiavelli may have written less about the 16th century and much more about the permanent nature of human power. Karl Marx argued that human history is driven by the struggle between social classes. He wasn't just criticizing the economic system of his time. He was proposing a completely different way of understanding how society works. Instead of believing that major historical events are shaped by kings, heroes, or extraordinary leaders, Marx argued that the real forces shaping the world are the economic relationships between those who own the means of production and those who must sell their labor to survive. This idea, mainly developed in Capital, deeply changed philosophy, economics, and politics, influencing social movements and governments across almost every continent. To understand this way of thinking, imagine society as a structure supported by human labor. People grow food, make clothes, build cities, develop technology, and keep businesses running. However, according to Marx, the people who do this work do not always control what they produce. In many cases, the results of their effort belong to someone else, the owner of the factory, the land, the company, or the capital. This difference between those who produce and those who own is where the central conflict described by Marx begins. According to him, Every organized society has groups with opposing interests. In ancient times, there were masters and slaves. During feudalism, nobles and serfs. In industrial society, the main groups were the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie represents those who control the means of production, such as factories, machines, land, and investments. The proletariat is made up of workers who sell their labor in exchange for wages. For Marx, these two classes depend on each other to exist, but their interests are never exactly the same. One side aims to increase profits, while the other seeks higher wages, better living conditions, and a larger share of the wealth they help create. It is important to understand that Marx did not see this conflict as a matter of personality or morality. He did not claim that all business owners are bad or that all workers are morally superior. His argument was structural. Within the capitalist system, each group tends to act according to the incentives it receives. Business owners try to reduce costs and increase productivity to stay competitive. Workers try to improve their wages and living conditions. Even when both sides act in good faith, their interests often come into conflict. For Marx, this tension is not about individual intentions, but about the logic of the economic system itself. In Capital, Marx expands this idea with the concept of surplus value, one of the core elements of his theory. He argues that workers produce more value than they receive in wages. The difference between the value created and the value paid to the worker becomes profit for the owner of the means of production. This surplus is what allows wealth to accumulate and capital to grow. In Marx's view, this is not an exception in the system. It is how the system normally works. Without this difference, capitalism would not be able to expand. This interpretation led Marx to conclude that class conflict is not a temporary problem, but a permanent feature of this economic model. The more wealth is concentrated in one group, the greater the gap between those who control resources and those who rely only on their labor. Over time, this tension can lead to social movements, strikes, reforms, or even revolutions that completely reshape society. Another important concept developed by Marx is alienation. He argued that many workers become disconnected from what they produce. Instead of seeing their work as something creative or personally meaningful, they begin to see it only as a way to survive. The final product belongs to someone else. The decisions about how production is organized also belong to someone else. Gradually, workers lose the feeling that they control their own labor. For Marx, this separation between people and the results of their work creates a deep sense of detachment and dehumanization. This idea goes far beyond the factories of the 19th century. Even with the massive technological changes since then, many of the questions Marx raised are still relevant today. In a world shaped by automation, digital platforms, and a global economy, debates about wealth distribution, income inequality, working conditions, and economic imbalance are still ongoing. Although today's reality is far more complex than the one Marx observed, his ideas are still used as a starting point for understanding these issues. This is also why his philosophy is often considered controversial. If society is truly built on ongoing conflict between groups with opposing interests, then the idea of complete social harmony becomes very difficult to sustain. This challenges views that present society is a place where everyone naturally moves in the same direction. For Marx, major changes rarely happen because everyone agrees. They happen when different groups struggle over control of wealth, power, and resources. At the same time, reducing Marx to simply a defender of revolution or violence would be an oversimplification. Before proposing change, he spent much of his life carefully studying how the capitalist economy actually works. His research included statistics, historical data, working conditions, and the industrial changes of his time. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, it is clear that he was trying to explain the mechanisms that produce both wealth and inequality in modern society. His influence went beyond philosophy and reached sociology, economics, political science, history, and even social psychology. Some governments claimed to be inspired by his ideas, while others built their policies in opposition to them. This global impact also made Marx one of the most debated thinkers in history. For some, he revealed structural problems that still exist today. For others, his predictions about the future of capitalism did not come true as expected. Either way, few thinkers have sparked such intense debate for so long. There is also an often overlooked idea in his philosophy. Marx believed that people make their own history, but not under conditions they freely choose. This means each generation is born into an existing economic, political, and social structure. Opportunities, challenges, and even many personal choices are shaped by this context. This idea encourages us to reflect on how much of our lives truly come from personal effort, and how much is shaped by historical conditions beyond our control. More than a century after Capital was published, the question Marx raised is still debated in universities, governments, companies, and society at large. Are economic conflicts inevitable? Is it possible to build a society where different groups share the benefits of wealth without constant tension? Or will the struggle between interests always be part of human organization? Whatever the answer, understanding Karl Marx means understanding one of the most influential interpretations of human history ever created. His philosophy remains challenging precisely because it forces us to look beyond appearances and ask who truly benefits from the way society is structured. Few philosophers have been as misunderstood as Friedrich Nietzsche. When people hear that he spoke about being beyond good and evil, they often assume he was encouraging selfishness, cruelty, or a complete rejection of moral values. However, that interpretation is far from the real meaning of his philosophy. In works like Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche is not telling people to live without ethics. His goal is much deeper, to challenge the idea that the values we follow are eternal and universal truths. For him, most people never truly choose what they believe. They simply inherit customs, traditions, and rules created by previous generations. Nietzsche observed that from childhood, we learn what is considered right or wrong before we even develop the ability to think critically. Families pass down values. Schools reinforce certain behaviors. Religion presents moral principles. Culture defines what is admirable or unacceptable. Over time, these ideas become so natural that we rarely stop to ask where they came from. For Nietzsche, this is exactly the problem. When we accept values only because they have always existed, we stop living authentically and start following a script written by others. This criticism appears strongly in Beyond Good and Evil. In this book, Nietzsche challenges the Western philosophical tradition that treats morality as something absolute. Instead of simply asking, "What is good?" he asks a much more uncomfortable question. Who decided what we call good? Who benefits from these rules? In his view, every moral system is created within a historical, social, and psychological context. There is no set of values that exists completely outside human relationships. Every moral system carries interests, power struggles, and specific ways of seeing the world. From this line of thought came one of his most famous ideas, the distinction between master morality and slave morality. According to Nietzsche, in ancient societies, strong, independent, and confident groups valued traits like courage, strength, creativity, and greatness. These formed what he called master morality. Over time, oppressed groups who could not directly confront those in power began to value different traits such as humility, obedience, resignation, and endurance of suffering. For Nietzsche, this reversal of values gave rise to what he called slave morality, a system built more on resentment than on a celebration of life. This analysis often causes controversy because many people believe Nietzsche was defending domination of the weak by the strong. But that conclusion oversimplifies his thinking. He was not arguing for violence or oppression. His concern was different. He believed that a society that turns conformity into a virtue can suppress creative, independent individuals who are capable of pushing human limits. His criticism was aimed at what he saw as a morality based on fear of those who think differently. It is in this context that one of the most famous ideas from Thus Spoke Zarathustra appears, the concept of the Bermensch, often translated as the Overman or Superman. Contrary to popular belief, Nietzsche was not describing a superhuman being with special powers or a ruler destined to dominate others. The Bermensch represents an ideal of human development. It is someone who has the courage to let go of fixed truths, face the uncertainty of freedom, and create their own values through reflection, experience, and personal responsibility. This process, however, is neither easy nor comfortable. Creating your own values means giving up the security of shared beliefs. It is much easier to follow what everyone already accepts than to take responsibility for building a life based on your own convictions. Nietzsche saw this as one of the greatest challenges of human existence. True freedom requires courage because it removes the option of hiding behind tradition, authority, or the opinion of the majority. This idea becomes even more powerful when Nietzsche introduces one of his most famous statements. God is dead. This phrase, often misunderstood, is not a celebration of atheism or a literal claim about God's existence. Nietzsche was describing a cultural shift. With the rise of science, reason, and social change, many traditional religious certainties were losing their influence over people's lives. The problem was that, after losing these guiding beliefs, humanity had not yet found new foundations to replace them. The result would be a deep sense of meaninglessness. To confront this emptiness, Nietzsche proposes the creation of new values. But he does not say that all values are equally valid. On the contrary, the best values are those that affirm life, strengthen the individual, encourage creativity, and allow human potential to grow. True freedom is not about doing anything without consequences, but about building a life that reflects who you truly are, without constantly depending on approval from others. Another key concept in his philosophy is the will to power. Often misunderstood as a simple desire to dominate others, this idea has a much broader meaning. The will to power represents the inner force that pushes human beings to grow, create, overcome difficulties, and transform their reality. It appears whenever someone faces fear, develops new skills, breaks limitations, or tries to become a better version of themselves. In this sense, Nietzsche sees life as a continuous process of self-overcoming, not a constant search for comfort. Perhaps no idea captures this spirit better than the eternal return. Nietzsche asks the reader to imagine having to live the exact same life, with all its joys and suffering, over and over again for eternity. This idea is not meant as a literal theory about the universe. It is an existential test. If you knew you would relive every decision forever, would you still make the same choices? Or would you realize that you are living in a way that does not match what you truly value? This thought forces each person to take full responsibility for their own life. This is why Nietzsche is still considered a dangerous philosopher. Not because he promotes the destruction of morality, but because he challenges the foundations on which many people build their lives. Questioning deeply rooted values can create insecurity, conflict, and even personal crisis. After all, letting go of certainty is never comfortable. However, for Nietzsche, this discomfort is the first step toward a truly authentic life. His influence goes beyond philosophy and reaches psychology, literature, art, sociology, and even modern culture. Many current debates about identity, freedom, authenticity, and the meaning of life are directly or indirectly connected to his ideas. At the same time, his work has often been misused or distorted to support ideologies he never defended, which makes it even more important to understand his philosophy in its proper context. In the end, Nietzsche does not offer ready-made answers. Instead, he raises questions that shake our deepest certainties. Do your choices truly reflect who you are, or just what you have been taught to repeat? If all social expectations disappeared today, what values would still guide your life? Perhaps this is the real challenge of beyond good and evil. And thus spoke Zarathustra. The hardest freedom is not escaping rules imposed by others, but finding the courage to consciously create the principles by which your life is worth living. Thomas Hobbes argued that without a strong authority capable of keeping order, human life would be a war of all against all. He presented one of the most provocative views of human nature. Unlike philosophers who believed people are naturally inclined toward cooperation or kindness, Hobbes saw a much darker reality. In his work Leviathan, published in 1651, he describes a world where, without laws or a common power, every individual would constantly have to fight to protect their own life. This idea has lasted for centuries and still influences debates about politics, security, freedom, and how society should be organized. To understand Hobbes's thinking, we need to imagine an extreme situation, a place with no government, no police, no courts, and no institutions to enforce rules. There are no laws protecting property, enforcing contracts, or preventing violence. Each person depends only on their own strength, intelligence, and ability to survive. Hobbes calls this hypothetical condition the state of nature. It is important to understand that he was not describing a real moment in history, but creating a philosophical experiment to answer a basic question. How would humans behave if no authority existed? His answer became famous because it broke with optimistic views of human nature. According to Hobbes, people share similar desires, compete for the same resources, and above all, fear death. When two people want something that only one can have, rivalry begins. When no one can fully trust the intentions of others, suspicion grows. And when everyone is trying to protect their own interests, a constant sense of insecurity takes over. Not everyone needs to be violent all the time. The simple possibility of violence is enough for fear to shape everyone's behavior. In this context, Hobbes wrote one of the most famous lines in political philosophy. Life in the state of nature would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This does not mean he believed humans are born evil. His view is more complex. For Hobbes, even reasonable people can act aggressively when they live without collective protection. The problem is not only human character, but the lack of a system that prevents fear and insecurity from controlling relationships. This idea was strongly shaped by the time Hobbes lived in. 17th century England was marked by intense political and religious conflict, culminating in the English Civil War. The country was torn apart by violent struggles between groups fighting for power. Hobbes witnessed the breakdown of order and saw how seemingly stable institutions could collapse quickly into chaos. These experiences reinforced his belief that political stability is not guaranteed, but a fragile achievement that depends on strong authority. From this concern comes the concept of the Leviathan. In his book, Hobbes uses the image of a giant sea monster from biblical tradition to symbolize the sovereign state. This state has enough power to create laws, settle disputes, and punish those who threaten peace. For Hobbes, what matters most is not who rules, but that there is a recognized authority strong enough to prevent society from falling back into the state of nature. Without this power, human life would remain trapped in constant uncertainty. The foundation of this system is the social contract. Hobbes argues that, recognizing the dangers of life without protection, individuals agree to give up part of their natural freedom and transfer it to a sovereign authority. In return, they receive safety, stability, and a chance to build a functioning society. This agreement is not based on kindness or generosity. It comes from a rational understanding that limited freedom is far better than constant fear of violence. In this sense, obeying laws is not just a duty, it is the price of civilization itself. This idea is still highly relevant because it raises a question we continue to face today. How much freedom are we willing to give up in exchange for security? Finding this balance is never easy. The more power we give the state, the greater the risk of abuse. On the other hand, a weak authority may fail to prevent violence, protect rights, or ensure justice. Hobbes recognized this risk, but believed that the absence of government was even more dangerous than an overly strong one. In his view, even the harshest government was better than a return to chaos. This is why many people consider his philosophy dangerous. By defending a powerful sovereign, Hobbes opened the door to interpretations that can justify authoritarian rule. Critics have argued that his theory could be used to support leaders who concentrate too much power, limit individual freedoms, and weaken public participation. However, reducing Hobbes to a supporter of authoritarianism is an oversimplification. His main goal was not to praise rulers, but to find a way to prevent violence from destroying society. Another often overlooked point is that Hobbes places great importance on human reason. For him, it is precisely rational thinking that leads people to see the benefits of cooperation. Individuals understand that alone they live under constant threat. By agreeing to shared rules, they create conditions for trade, science, culture, education, and progress. In other words, civilization becomes possible because people recognize that limiting individual freedom in certain ways benefits everyone. This idea is still present in many aspects of modern life. Whenever we discuss laws, justice systems, public safety, individual rights, or collective responsibilities, we are dealing with questions Hobbes raised over 300 years ago. In times of crisis, such as wars, pandemics, natural disasters, or institutional collapse, the debate about authority becomes even more central. How far should the state go? When does protecting society justify limiting freedom? These questions remain open because they do not have simple answers. Hobbes's influence goes beyond political philosophy and reaches law, political science, international relations, and sociology. His concept of the state of nature, for example, inspired theories about conflict between countries, showing how, in the absence of a global authority, states often act based on mistrust and self-preservation. Even when cooperation exists, it usually depends on agreements that reduce fear and increase predictability. Perhaps the greatest contribution of Leviathan is the reminder that peace does not happen on its own. It must be built, protected, and constantly maintained. Hobbes forces us to face something we often ignore. Much of the stability we experience in daily life depends on institutions we only notice when they fail. It is easy to criticize rules, laws, and authorities. It is much harder to imagine life without them. Hobbes did not just write about governments. He wrote about fear, trust, and the fragile nature of human coexistence. His philosophy remains powerful because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. If all laws disappeared tomorrow, would cooperation still hold society together, or would conflict take over? There may never be a final answer to this question, but by challenging our understanding of human nature, Thomas Hobbes remains one of the most influential and controversial thinkers in the history of philosophy. There is a question that few people are brave enough to ask themselves. How many of the choices you believe are truly yours were actually shaped by society? The way you work, believe, obey laws, follow traditions, or seek approval may feel completely natural. But what if much of this behavior is not really your own will, but ideas that were placed in your mind from childhood? This was exactly the provocation that led Max Stirner to write one of the most radical works in modern philosophy, The Ego and Its Own. His thinking does not only challenge political or religious institutions, it questions any authority that tries to place itself above individual freedom. Stirner believed that human beings are surrounded by concepts that have a powerful influence over their minds. Words like duty, nation, morality, humanity, state, and even God are often treated as higher truths that everyone must obey. For him, however, these ideas do not have an independent existence. They are human creations, but over time, they began to control the very people who created them. Instead of people controlling these ideas, the ideas began controlling people. In The Ego and Its Own, Stirner calls these concepts spooks, or ghosts of the mind, not because they are imaginary in the usual sense, but because they influence our lives, even though they have no physical reality. A person may sacrifice their desires, happiness, and even their life in the name of honor, nation, religion, or any other abstract ideal. According to Stirner, this reveals a dangerous reversal. What humans created ends up ruling over humans themselves. This critique reaches almost every known institution. Stirner does not spare religion, which he sees as a form of submission to an invisible authority. He also questions the state, which demands obedience in the name of the common good. He criticizes moral systems that dictate how everyone should behave, regardless of individual choice. Even political movements that promise equality are not exempt from his analysis. For him, replacing one authority with another is still a form of servitude. It does not matter whether the authority comes from a king, a church, a political party, or an ancient tradition. Whenever an individual stops acting based on their own will and blindly obeys an external principle, they lose part of their autonomy. This is why Stirner places the ego at the center of his philosophy. But it is important to understand what he truly means by this. When he speaks of egoism, he is not defending arrogance, cruelty, or a lack of concern for others. His egoism is philosophical. It means recognizing that each person is unique and that no abstract idea should matter more than the real, concrete existence of the individual. Before serving any cause, a person must ask whether that cause truly matches their own interests, or if they simply learn to accept it without question. This perspective breaks sharply with earlier philosophical traditions. For centuries, many thinkers tried to discover universal principles that should guide all of humanity. Stirner does the opposite. Instead of searching for a truth that applies to everyone, he argues that each individual must build their own relationship with the world. There is no single moral rule that can be imposed equally on all people. Every human being has different desires, needs, and goals, and it is this uniqueness that deserves to be preserved. One of the most radical aspects of his philosophy appears in how he understands freedom. For many philosophers, being free means having rights granted by society. For Stirner, this is still a form of dependence. If freedom depends on permission from the state or any other institution, it is still controlled by an external authority. True freedom, in his view, exists only when a person stops automatically accepting any higher power over their own will. Naturally, this idea raises many criticisms. If everyone puts their own interests above everything else, how can society function? Wouldn't this lead to complete selfishness, where no one respects anyone else? Stirner was aware of this objection and offered a very different answer from most philosophers. He believed that voluntary relationships are far more genuine than those based on obligation. When two people cooperate because they both want to, that connection is stronger than any bond created by force or tradition. Because of this, he introduces the idea of the union of egoists. This is a free association between individuals who cooperate as long as it makes sense for both sides. There is no permanent submission and no absolute duty. Each participant remains free to enter, stay, or leave the relationship according to their own will. Instead of contracts imposed by institutions, Stirner imagines relationships built on conscious choice and shared interest. This way of thinking makes his philosophy one of the most individualistic ever created. While many thinkers focused on strengthening society, Stirner focused on the concrete individual. For him, concepts like humanity, nation, or people are abstractions. The only real being is the person in front of us, with their own desires, fears, and personal goals. Whenever we sacrifice this real existence for the sake of a collective idea, we are valuing the concept more than the human being. This is likely why his work has been considered so dangerous. Taken to the extreme, it seems to undermine the foundations on which many societies are built. Religions depend on shared faith. States depend on obedience to laws. Communities depend on common values. Stirner puts all of this into question and asks, do these institutions exist to serve people? Or do people exist to serve institutions? This shift in perspective remains deeply unsettling. His influence can be seen in later philosophical movements, especially existentialism, individualist anarchism, and modern reflections on autonomy, identity, and personal freedom. Even thinkers who strongly disagreed with his conclusions recognized the power of his critique. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, developed ideas about creating one's own values that are often compared to Stirner's provocations, even though each followed very different philosophical paths. At the same time, his philosophy demands a great deal of responsibility. If no authority has absolute legitimacy over your life, then you can no longer blame tradition, society, or religion for your choices. The individual becomes directly responsible for the consequences of what they decide to do. Freedom is no longer just a right, it becomes a burden, because every decision depends entirely on personal judgment. This is perhaps the hardest part of Stirner's thought. It is easy to follow rules set by others. It is much harder to build a life based on your own decisions, knowing there is no higher authority to confirm whether each choice is right or wrong. His philosophy offers no security and no ready-made answers. It leaves only one question, still extremely relevant today. Who is really in control of your life right now? You or the ideas you have learned to obey without ever questioning them? This tension is exactly what makes The Ego in its own one of the most daring and provocative works in the history of philosophy. Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing that no one else can make decisions for you anymore. There are no invisible rules telling you who you should be, what career to choose, how to think, or what path to follow. At first, this sounds like the dream of total freedom. But now imagine the other side of that reality. If no one decides for you, then there is also no one to blame when your choices go wrong. This is exactly where Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy begins. In Being and Nothingness, he presents one of the most challenging ideas in philosophy. Human beings are condemned to be free. And this condemnation, while opening endless possibilities, also brings a weight that few people can handle. For Sartre, most of us spend much of our lives trying to escape this responsibility. We like to believe we are defined by the family we are born into, the society we live in, the education we receive, or the circumstances we encounter along the way. Even though all of these factors do influence our lives, Sartre argues that they never fully remove our freedom. Even in the most difficult situations, there is still always some space to choose how we respond. And it is exactly this ability to choose that defines who we are. This idea appears in one of his most famous statements: existence precedes essence. At first, this may sound complicated, but it represents a major break from centuries of philosophical tradition. For a long time, people believed that every human being had a fixed nature, a set purpose, or a predefined essence. Sartre completely rejects this view. For him, no one is born meant to be a specific kind of person. We first exist. Then, through our choices, we build who we become. This means our identity is not fully formed at birth. It is built every day. Every decision, no matter how small, helps shape the person we are becoming. Choosing to stay silent when you could speak, accepting a job, quitting a project, helping someone, or ignoring an opportunity are all actions that shape our existence. According to Sartre, we are not defined only by what we think about ourselves, but mainly by the choices we make throughout life. But this freedom is far from comfortable. On the contrary, Sartre believed it creates an unavoidable feeling of anxiety. Unlike fear, which has a clear object, anxiety comes from realizing that we are fully responsible for the consequences of our decisions. There is no universal handbook that shows the right path. There are no guarantees that any choice will lead to success. Many times, we are forced to decide without having all the answers. It is exactly this lack of certainty that makes freedom so heavy. Every time we choose one path, we give up many others. We can never experience all possibilities at once. Each decision closes some doors while opening others. And once a choice is made, we are the ones who must live with its results. For Sartre, this condition is part of human existence itself. To escape it is to escape who we truly are. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre introduces a concept called bad faith, one of the central ideas in his philosophy. Bad faith happens when a person tries to convince themselves that they are not free. They begin to believe they are nothing more than the role they play in society. A worker thinks they are only their job. A student believes they are only their grades. Someone stuck in a relationship says they cannot leave because they have no choice. For Sartre, this behavior is an unconscious attempt to avoid the responsibility that comes with freedom. According to him, it is much easier to believe we are permanent victims of circumstance than to admit that we are still making choices, even in very limited situations. This does not mean ignoring injustice, financial hardship, or social problems. Sartre fully recognized that people live under very different conditions. His main point is different. Even when we do not choose what happens to us, we still choose how we respond to what happens to us. That is where our freedom exists. Another fascinating part of his philosophy is how he views other people. Sartre is known for the famous phrase, "Hell is other people," from his play No Exit. For a long time, this line was understood as pessimism or dislike of human relationships. But its meaning is much deeper. Sartre was showing that the presence of others constantly forces us to see ourselves through their eyes. We are judged, evaluated, admired, or rejected. Often, we begin to live trying to meet other people's expectations instead of focusing on what we truly want to be. This conflict between our freedom and the gaze of others is present in almost every human relationship. How many decisions do we truly make because we want them? And how many are influenced by fear of criticism, rejection, or disapproval? Sartre believed this challenge affects everyone. Authenticity requires courage because it means making choices that others may not understand. That may be why his philosophy feels so unsettling. While many philosophical systems offer comfort through universal truths, Sartre removes those certainties. He does not present a fixed destiny or promise that there is an objective meaning waiting to be discovered. Instead, he places almost unlimited freedom in each person's hands and says that the meaning of life depends on the choices we make. For some, this is deeply empowering. For others, it can be frightening. His influence goes far beyond philosophy and reaches psychology, literature, theater, education, and even popular culture. The existentialism inspired by Sartre helped millions of people reflect on authenticity, responsibility, and identity in a time marked by wars, crises, and major social change. Even people who have never read Being and Nothingness often encounter questions that come from his philosophy. However, Sartre never claimed that living freely is easy. On the contrary, he believed freedom requires constant courage. It is not enough to make one decision and assume everything is settled. Every day brings new choices, new conflicts, and new responsibilities. Human existence is an ongoing process of building ourselves, where we can never simply stop and say our identity is complete. Perhaps the most challenging part of his thought is realizing that waiting for the perfect moment is also a choice. Staying still, delaying decisions, or letting others run your life does not remove responsibility. It simply means choosing not to act. For Sartre, even inaction plays a role in shaping who we are. In the end, his philosophy is not meant to comfort, but to awaken awareness. It reminds us that no life story is written only by fate, luck, or circumstances. At some point, every person takes part in writing their own story. And perhaps that is what makes Jean-Paul Sartre so provocative. When we realize we are the authors of our own existence, many excuses disappear, but something much more powerful appears, the real possibility of transforming who we are through the choices we make from this moment on. At some point in life, almost every human being asks a question that sounds simple, but carries enormous weight. What is the meaning of all this? Why do we wake up every day, face difficulties, build dreams, love people, and keep going, knowing that one day it will all end? These questions have followed humanity for thousands of years, and few philosophers had the courage to face them as honestly as Albert Camus. In his work, The Myth of Sisyphus, he begins with the conclusion that at first glance seems deeply pessimistic. Maybe the universe has no objective meaning. However, it is exactly from this realization that one of the most inspiring philosophies of the 20th century is born. Camus observed that there is a constant conflict between what we want and what the world actually offers. Human beings look for explanations, stability, justice, and purpose. We want to believe there is a reason for suffering, a plan for our existence, or a final answer to life's biggest questions. The problem is that the universe remains silent. Nature does not explain why some people suffer while others succeed. Death does not only take those who lived unfairly. Natural disasters do not distinguish between the innocent and the guilty. The more we search for a perfect logic behind everything, the more we realize that it may simply not exist. From this tension, Camus developed one of the central ideas of his philosophy, the absurd. It is important to understand that for him, the absurd does not mean that life is ridiculous or worthless. The absurd is born from the meeting of two realities. On one side, there is the human desire for meaning. On the other, there is a universe that offers no clear answers. The clash between these two forces creates a feeling of disconnection that becomes part of human existence. It is not the world alone that is absurd, nor the human being alone. The absurd exists precisely in the relationship between the two. This realization can appear suddenly. Someone wakes up, follows the same routine, goes to work, comes home, and suddenly asks themselves, why am I doing all of this? For years, these actions seemed completely natural, but at some point, they stop feeling obvious. According to Camus, this is exactly when we begin to notice the absurd nature of existence, not because life has changed, but because our perception of it has. In the opening pages of The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus makes a statement that shocked many readers. There is only one truly serious philosophical problem: suicide. This line is often misunderstood. He is not encouraging it. On the contrary, his goal is to explore a fundamental question. If life has no objective meaning, is it still worth living? His entire work is built to answer yes. To explain his answer, Camus turns to a figure from Greek mythology, Sisyphus. According to the myth, Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to roll a huge boulder up a mountain. Just as he was about to reach the top, the stone would roll back down, forcing him to start over again for eternity. It is a task with no reward, no progress, and no end. At first glance, it seems like the harshest punishment imaginable. However, Camus sees this story in a completely different way. For him, Sisyphus represents all of us. We also repeat routines, face struggles, restart projects, and deal with challenges that never fully disappear. The difference lies in how we respond to this condition. Instead of giving in to despair, Camus imagines Sisyphus fully aware of his situation. He knows the stone will fall again. He knows his task will never end. And still, he keeps pushing it up the mountain. This is where one of the most famous lines in existential philosophy appears. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. This statement seems contradictory, but it captures the heart of Camus' thought. Happiness does not necessarily depend on finding an ultimate meaning for existence. It can come from accepting reality as it is, without illusions, and still choosing to live fully. This attitude is called revolt. But it is not a violent revolt against the world. It is an existential revolt. It means rejecting the idea that the lack of answers makes life meaningless. For Camus, living fully means continuing to create, love, learn, work, and appreciate beauty, even while knowing there are no final guarantees. The real victory is not solving the absurd, but refusing to let it destroy our will to live. This position sets Camus apart from many other existentialist philosophers. While some tried to build new systems of meaning to replace old beliefs, Camus believed that this often only created new illusions. In his view, accepting the mystery of existence takes more courage than inventing answers to remove uncertainty. Clarity becomes a form of freedom because it allows us to see reality without relying on promises that may never be proven. Another key aspect of his philosophy is the focus on the present. If there is no guaranteed destiny that justifies every moment of life, then each experience gains its own value. A sincere conversation, a friendship, a landscape, a work of art, or a simple moment of peace are no longer just steps toward a bigger goal. They become essential parts of existence itself. Life does not need a final explanation to be lived. This is likely why Camus continues to influence so many people across generations. We live in a society that often ties happiness to future achievements. When you reach a certain job, when you achieve financial stability, when you find the right person, or when all problems are solved, then life will finally begin. Camus challenges this logic by showing that life is happening now, in the middle of imperfections, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. His philosophy is also a defense of human dignity in the face of uncertainty. Even while recognizing that the universe is indifferent to our desires, Camus never concludes that everything is meaningless. On the contrary, he believes that this lack of imposed meaning makes our choices even more valuable. It is we who give importance to the people we love, the projects we build, and the moments we choose to live. Throughout the 20th century, his ideas deeply influenced literature, philosophy, psychology, and cultural movements, trying to understand the sense of emptiness that followed wars and major social crises. His writing remains relevant because it speaks to a question that still affects millions of people. How do we live when there are no final answers to life's biggest questions? Perhaps Albert Camus' greatest contribution is showing that hope does not need to come from certainty. It can come from the courage to keep moving forward, even when the path does not reveal its destination. Instead of waiting for the universe to provide a ready-made purpose, he invites each person to turn their own experience into something worth living. And that may be one of the most freeing ideas ever written. The value of life does not depend on a perfect explanation, but on the intensity with which we choose to live it, even knowing that some questions will remain open forever. For much of history, many philosophers believed that a good ruler should earn the people's respect through virtue, wisdom, and moral example. The idea seemed simple. When a leader is just and honest, people naturally follow them. But not everyone agreed with this view. In ancient China, a thinker observing political instability, constant wars, and struggles for power came to a very different conclusion. For Han Fei, trusting in people's goodness was a dangerous mistake. A strong state could not depend on the morality of its rulers or the goodwill of its citizens. What truly kept society stable were clear laws, unavoidable punishments, and an authority capable of inspiring respect, or more precisely fear. Han Fei lived during the turbulent Warring States period, a time marked by non-stop conflict between different Chinese kingdoms. War was part of daily life. Alliances were constantly broken, and rulers were always threatened by internal conspiracies and outside invasions. In this environment, idealistic ideas seemed too weak to guarantee a state's survival. While philosophers like Confucius argued that a ruler's virtue would set an example for society, Han Fei believed this trust in human nature ignored reality. His work, collected in the book Han Feizi, became the main foundation of legalism, a philosophical school that promoted governance based on clear rules, strict enforcement, and harsh punishments. Unlike other Chinese philosophical traditions, legalism did not focus on how to make people morally better. Its concern was far more practical. How do you stop people from breaking the rules? For Han Fei, expecting people to act correctly out of conscience was naive. A successful government should create a system where obeying the law is always more beneficial than breaking it. This view is based on a very realistic understanding of human nature. Han Fei believed that most people act out of self-interest. They seek benefits, avoid harm, and respond to incentives around them. This does not mean people are incapable of doing good. It simply means a ruler cannot build an entire society, assuming everyone will always act correctly. In his view, a political system must function even when individuals are selfish, ambitious, or opportunistic. That is why Han Fei places the law above individuals. In his philosophy, the state should not depend on the character of the ruler. A wise king can be followed by an incompetent one. An honest administrator can be replaced by a corrupt one. If stability depends only on the moral character of leaders, society will always be vulnerable to changes in power. Instead, Han Fei argues that laws must be permanent, known by everyone, and applied without exceptions. The strength of government lies not in the goodness of rulers, but in the predictability of rules. Another key element of his thinking is fairness. Although he is often remembered for harsh punishments, Han Fei insisted that the law must apply equally to everyone, regardless of wealth, influence, or social status. A system where friends of the ruler receive special treatment or avoid consequences quickly loses authority. For him, the credibility of institutions depends on the certainty that no one is above the law. Within this logic, fear plays a central role. Han Fei argues that the expectation of swift and certain punishment has a much stronger effect on human behavior than moral preaching or emotional appeals. If someone believes they can break a rule without consequences, they are more likely to do so. But if punishment is guaranteed, people tend to act with much more caution. The goal is not to spread suffering, but to create a system where the possibility of punishment reduces the need to constantly apply it. This way of thinking still sparks debate today. After all, what really keeps society functioning is people's moral sense or effective laws. When someone respects speed limits, pays taxes, or honors a contract, are they acting out of ethics or fear of consequences? Han Fei believed that, in practice, fear of punishment plays a much larger role than many people are willing to admit. However, his philosophy is not only about punishment. It also emphasizes efficient government organization. Han Fei argued that public positions should be filled by capable people, judged by their actual performance rather than personal connections or family status. Officials should be rewarded when they perform well and held accountable when they fail. This focus on administrative performance shows that his concern went beyond simple repression. His goal was to build a government that functions in a predictable and efficient way. At the same time, this efficiency comes with a cost. In a system where fear becomes the main tool of control, there is always a risk that authority will exceed its limits. Governments can use laws to protect society, but they can also use them to silence opponents, control opinions, and concentrate power. This is where many critics see the greatest danger of legalism. When stability becomes more important than freedom, it can lead to increasingly authoritarian rule. Chinese history itself offers examples of this tension. Han Fei's ideas strongly influenced the Qin state, which unified China in 221 BC. Under Emperor Qin Shi Huang, many legalist principles were put into practice. The country gained a highly centralized administration and standardized writing, currency, and measurements, but also experienced censorship, persecution, and extremely harsh punishments. For some historians, this shows the administrative efficiency of legalism. For others, it reveals the dangers of nearly unlimited power. Still, it would be a mistake to see Han Fei only as a defender of cruelty. His philosophy comes from a very practical question. How can a state avoid falling back into war and internal chaos? In his view, disorder cost far more lives than strict laws ever could. He believed a strong government could prevent even greater tragedies by stopping chaos before it begins. His influence is still visible today in debates about public security, anti-corruption policies, institutional strength, and law enforcement. Whenever discussions arise about stricter penalties, stronger state power, or tougher rules to maintain order, parts of this reasoning directly or indirectly echo ideas first developed by Han Fei over 2,000 years ago. At the same time, his philosophy forces us to think about a delicate balance. A society based only on trust can become vulnerable to those who do not follow the rules. On the other hand, a society ruled only by fear risks turning citizens into people who obey simply because they are afraid, not because they understand justice. Perhaps the real challenge is not choosing between kindness and authority, but understanding how much each should contribute to building a stable society. That question has lasted for centuries, making Han Fei one of the most controversial and influential political thinkers in history. While some philosophers believed that order depends on more laws, more rules, and more control, Laozi moved in the opposite direction. Instead of asking how to dominate the world, he tried to understand how to live in harmony with it. This shift in perspective led to one of the most influential works in Eastern philosophy, the Tao Te Ching. Written over 2,000 years ago, the text presents an idea that still challenges how we think about success, leadership, and power today. According to Laozi, too much control often creates the very problems it tries to prevent. Paradoxically, the more someone tries to control everything around them, the more likely they are to lose balance. The central concept of this philosophy is the Tao, a word usually translated as the way. However, this translation does not fully capture its depth. The Tao is not just a path to follow or a set of moral rules. It is the natural order that holds the universe together, a constant flow that exists before human laws, institutions, and social conventions. For Laozi, everything that exists is part of the spontaneous movement of reality. Problems begin when humans try to impose their own will on this natural flow. According to the Tao Te Ching, much of human suffering comes from this constant attempt to control what cannot fully be controlled. We want to manage the future, predict every outcome, remove all risk, and keep everything exactly as planned. But reality never stays still. People change, circumstances shift, opportunities appear and disappear. The more we resist this constant change, the more emotional strain we create. It is in this context that one of the most famous and most misunderstood ideas in Taoist philosophy appears. Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action. At first glance, it may sound like laziness or complete passivity, but Laozi is suggesting the opposite. Wu Wei does not mean doing nothing. It means acting in the most natural way possible, without forcing situations, and without struggling against the flow of things, when that resistance only increases suffering. A common image helps explain this idea. Water. Water is one of the softest elements in nature. It has none of the hardness of stone or the apparent strength of metal. Yet over time, it can shape mountains, carve through rocks, and transform entire landscapes. It does not win by force, but by adapting without losing its essence. For Laozi, this is one of nature's greatest lessons. Real strength does not always come from resistance. Often, it comes from flexibility. This way of thinking is a deep critique of humanity's obsession with control. In many cultures, we are taught that success means controlling every variable, planning every detail, and never showing weakness. Laozi points out that this constant need for control often creates anxiety, frustration, and unnecessary conflict. The more we try to hold on to something that is always changing, the more we suffer when we realize it cannot be held. His philosophy also offers a very different view of leadership. While other thinkers defended strong rulers who impose authority through force or strict laws, Laozi believed the best leader is the one whose presence is barely noticed. In the Tao Te Ching, he writes that the ideal ruler guides the people in such a way that when the work is done, they feel they accomplished everything on their own. This quiet style of leadership stands in sharp contrast to models based on constant displays of power. Another fascinating aspect of Laozi's thinking is his distrust of excessive formal knowledge. This idea can sound strange at first, but it needs to be understood correctly. Laozi does not reject wisdom or learning. His criticism is aimed at the accumulation of concepts that distance people from direct experience of reality. In his view, the more we try to explain everything only through theories and categories, the more we risk losing touch with the simplicity of life. Real understanding depends not only on intellect, but also on the ability to observe, feel, and perceive the natural flow of things. This appreciation of simplicity appears repeatedly in the Tao Te Ching. Laozi believed that many of society's complications are unnecessary. The constant pursuit of wealth, status, and recognition often leads to competition, envy, and ongoing dissatisfaction. The more desires we accumulate, the more we depend on external circumstances to feel happy. In contrast, a simple life makes it possible to find contentment in things that do not rely on status or power. However, it would be a serious mistake to interpret this philosophy as an invitation to passivity. Laozi never suggests that we should abandon goals or accept injustice without response. Wu Wei is about acting intelligently, choosing the right moment, and avoiding wasted energy on useless struggles. There is a huge difference between giving up action and acting in harmony with circumstances. The first comes from resignation. The second requires awareness, patience, and a deep understanding of reality. This distinction becomes even more important when we see how Laozi's ideas have often been misunderstood throughout history. Some people have used the idea of non-action to justify passivity in the face of social or personal problems. But this interpretation completely misses the spirit of Taoism. Laozi does not propose abandoning action, but abandoning the urge to control everything. In many cases, acting less impulsively leads to far better results than constantly forcing effort in the wrong direction. His influence extends beyond philosophy into traditional Chinese medicine, martial arts, military strategy, psychology, ecology, and modern self-development practices. Across different cultures, his ideas inspire reflections on balance, mindfulness, and more harmonious ways of dealing with everyday challenges. Even people who have never read the Tao Te Ching often encounter principles influenced by this tradition without realizing their origin. Interestingly, many modern discoveries seem to echo some of his insights. Psychology shows that obsessively trying to control thoughts often makes them stronger. Creativity research suggests that good ideas often appear when the mind stops forcing solutions. Even elite athletes describe moments where peak performance happens when they stop overthinking and allow the body to move naturally. Although Laozi never developed scientific theories, his philosophy seems to point toward very similar understanding of the relationship between effort and spontaneity. Perhaps Laozi's greatest challenge is that he reverses what we usually associate with strength. In a world that values speed, competition, and constant control, he suggests that true wisdom may lie in calmness, flexibility, and the ability to follow the natural rhythm of reality. Instead of turning life into a constant battle against everything we cannot control, Taoism invites us to build a calmer relationship with the inevitable changes of existence. After all, not every door opens when we push harder. Some only open when we learn the right moment to turn the handle. There are moments when we finally get exactly what we wanted. After a lot of effort, we reach an important goal, buy something we thought we really needed, land a new job, or achieve a long-held dream. For a few days, maybe even a few weeks, we feel a strong sense of satisfaction. But soon after, something strange happens. The happiness fades, the excitement wears off, and a new desire takes its place. Another goal appears, another ambition, another need. This cycle seems endless. It was by observing this pattern that Arthur Schopenhauer developed one of the most pessimistic and at the same time most profound philosophies in Western thought. In his main work, The World is Will and Representation, Schopenhauer presents a radical idea. The essence of human existence is the will. But this will should not be understood simply as conscious decision-making or personal strength. For him, it is a deep, blind, and constant force that drives all living beings. It is what pushes us to seek food when we are hungry, rest when we are tired, recognition when we feel ignored, and achievements when we believe they will make us happy. The will is never satisfied for long. It simply shifts direction and finds a new object to desire. According to Schopenhauer, this explains why lasting happiness seems so hard to reach. While we want something, we feel a sense of lack. We believe our lives will be complete once we achieve a certain goal. However, once we get it, the desire only disappears temporarily. Soon, another one takes its place. Satisfaction is never final because the will itself must keep desiring in order to continue moving. In this way, life becomes an endless sequence of expectations and disappointments. This leads Schopenhauer to an uncomfortable conclusion. Suffering is not an exception in life, but a natural result of desire itself. While we want something we do not yet have, we feel anxiety, restlessness, or frustration. When we finally get what we wanted, we experience a brief moment of joy that quickly turns into boredom. And boredom, in turn, creates new desires. Life constantly swings between the pain of lack and the emptiness of temporary satisfaction. This view may sound extremely pessimistic, but Schopenhauer believed he was simply describing human life honestly. Instead of building optimistic theories about progress or lasting happiness, he tried to observe how the mind actually works. Everyday experience shows how often we link happiness to something that has not happened yet. We think we will finally feel complete once we reach a certain goal. But when we do, we quickly start chasing another one. The promise of happiness always stays just ahead of us. Schopenhauer was deeply influenced by Eastern traditions, especially Buddhism and Hinduism. Even though he did not practice these religions, he found ideas in them that closely matched his own thinking. Buddhism, for example, teaches that attachment to desire is the root of human suffering. This similarity is not a coincidence. Both recognize that the constant pursuit of material or emotional satisfaction rarely leads to inner peace. The more we depend on fulfilling our desires to feel happy, the more vulnerable we become to life's inevitable disappointments. Another important part of his philosophy is how he understands nature. For Schopenhauer, the will is not limited to humans. It exists in all living things. Animals struggle to survive, Plants grow toward light. Species compete for space and resources. Everywhere there is a constant drive to exist, reproduce, and overcome obstacles. The entire world seems driven by a force that never rests. The problem is that this same force creates constant conflict, both between individuals and within each person's own mind. Because of this, Schopenhauer rejects the idea that reason fully controls our actions. Although we can think, reflect, and plan, much of what we do is still driven by desires that arise before rational thought. We often believe we are freely choosing, when in reality, we are just finding explanations for impulses that were already there. This idea strongly influenced later thinkers, including Friedrich Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud, who also explored unconscious forces in human behavior. However, Schopenhauer did not believe we are doomed to endless suffering with no relief. Even though the will can never be fully eliminated, there are moments when we can temporarily silence it. One of these moments happens through aesthetic experience. When we face great art, music, or a powerful landscape, we can forget our personal concerns for a short time. In this brief state, we stop thinking about what we want and simply observe reality. For Schopenhauer, art offers a rare break from the constant pressure of the will. Music holds a special place in his philosophy. Schopenhauer believed it expresses the essence of the will directly, without relying on words or concepts. This may be why music can trigger such deep emotions that are often hard to explain. It reaches something that exists before thought, revealing parts of human experience that cannot be fully captured by language. Alongside art, Schopenhauer also valued compassion. This often surprises people who only know him as a pessimistic philosopher. For him, once we recognize that all humans share the same condition of suffering, we become more capable of empathy. Instead of constantly competing or seeking personal advantage at any cost, we begin to understand that pain is part of everyone's experience. Compassion comes from this shared recognition of human fragility. In this sense, his philosophy is not as dark as it first appears. Schopenhauer is not trying to convince people that life is not worth living. His goal is to break illusions that, in his view, create impossible expectations. By understanding how desire works, we may develop a more balanced relationship with our ambitions, without expecting each achievement to permanently fix our inner restlessness. His influence goes beyond philosophy and reaches psychology, literature, music, and various artistic movements. Writers like Thomas Mann, Marcel Proust, and Jorge Luis Borges engaged with his ideas. Composers like Richard Wagner acknowledged his influence. Even modern theories about hedonic adaptation, the tendency for people to quickly get used to new achievements, closely mirror observations Schopenhauer made more than a century earlier. In a world driven by consumption, constant ambition, and endless comparison with others, his reflections feel especially relevant today. We are surrounded by the promise that the next purchase, the next promotion, the next achievement, or the next recognition will finally bring lasting happiness. Schopenhauer invites us to question that cycle. Maybe the problem is not only what we have not yet achieved, but the very belief that final fulfillment is waiting somewhere ahead. His philosophy does not aim to erase desire or convince anyone to abandon life projects. Instead, it suggests a shift in perspective. Rather than always projecting happiness into a future that never arrives, it may be wiser to understand the limits of desire itself and recognize that no achievement will fully silence human restlessness. And there may be a strange kind of freedom in that realization. When we stop expecting the world to satisfy all our desires, we begin to see more clearly the value of the moments that are already part of our lives. When we hear the word war, we usually think of armies, battles, and combat fields. But what if someone said that many of life's most important conflicts happen far away from weapons? A job negotiation, a business dispute, an election, a difficult conversation, or even a simple disagreement between two people can involve strategies as complex as a military campaign. This is exactly the idea that made The Art of War by Sun Tzu one of the most influential books in history. Written more than 2,500 years ago, during a time of intense conflict in ancient China, this military treatise went far beyond warfare and came to influence political leaders, business people, diplomats, and scholars of human behavior. Sun Tzu's goal was never to glorify conflict. On the contrary, in the very first pages of his work, he makes it clear that war is an extremely serious matter for the state because it involves human lives and can determine a nation's survival. For this reason, it should never be driven by impulse, pride, or emotion. Every decision needed careful analysis. Before any confrontation, it was necessary to understand the terrain, evaluate available resources, know the opponent, and calculate the consequences of each move. From this logic comes one of the most famous phrases in all strategic philosophy. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. This statement goes far beyond a military context. Sun Tzu teaches that the first step in any effective strategy is awareness. Those who ignore their own limitations tend to overestimate themselves. Those who do not understand the opponent risk reacting too late. In this sense, knowledge becomes a much more powerful weapon than brute force. Another central principle of the art of war is adaptation. Sun Tzu observes that no battle stays the same from beginning to end. Circumstances constantly change, and a good strategist is never trapped by rigid plans. Just like water takes the shape of whatever container it is in, an effective strategy must adjust to the conditions of the moment. Insisting on the same approach when reality has changed is a direct path to failure. True intelligence lies in knowing when to advance, retreat, wait, or completely change direction. This emphasis on flexibility explains why Sun Tzu is so skeptical of impulsive behavior. Many leaders believe that acting quickly shows strength. However, acting without understanding the situation can produce the opposite result. For him, decisions driven by pride often turn small problems into major defeats. A patient strategist observes before acting. They analyze the situation, identify opportunities, and choose the most favorable moment for each move. Perhaps the most surprising idea in his work is the claim that the greatest victory is the one achieved without fighting. For Sun Tzu, defeating an enemy through destruction is only a partial solution. It is far more effective to prevent the conflict from happening in the first place. Convincing an opponent to give up before battle, weakening their willingness to fight, or building such a strong position that conflict becomes unnecessary are signs of superior intelligence. In his view, war should always be the last resort, never the first. This perspective helps explain why the art of war came to be studied far beyond the military world. In business, for example, companies try to understand competitors, identify trends, and anticipate market changes before making major decisions. In diplomacy, governments often use negotiations, alliances, and influence strategies to avoid direct conflict. Even in personal relationships, understanding another person's interests, emotions, and intentions often produces far better results than constant confrontation. However, this is also where one of the most dangerous misinterpretations of Sun Tzu's thinking appears. Many people began to see all human relationships as manipulation games, where every conversation hides hidden interests and every action must be calculated for advantage. This turns his philosophy into a manual for psychological manipulation, but that was never the original intent. Sun Tzu speaks about strategy, not dishonesty. He values intelligence, preparation, and planning, but he does not encourage the destruction of trust between people. Another important lesson appears in his view of leadership. For Sun Tzu, an effective commander does not rule through authority alone. They inspire trust, maintain discipline, communicate goals clearly, and deeply understand those they lead. An unmotivated army is unlikely to win, no matter how advanced its weapons are. A group's strength depends as much on the leader's competence as on the trust between its members. This focus on the human factor sets the art of war apart from many later military treatises. Sun Tzu recognizes that soldiers are not just pieces on a board. They have emotions, fears, expectations, and physical limits. Ignoring these elements weakens any strategy. This insight remains highly relevant in modern environments where teams must cooperate to achieve shared goals. Leaders who focus only on results often end up weakening the very people responsible for delivering them. He also highlights the importance of timing. Not every opportunity should be taken immediately. In some cases, waiting is the smartest decision. In others, quick action is essential. Knowing this balance requires constant observation of reality. Sun Tzu believed that many failures do not come from lack of ability, but from choosing the wrong moment to act. His philosophy also teaches that wasting resources is a silent form of defeat. Long wars consume wealth, exhaust soldiers, and weaken the state. In the same way, prolonged conflicts in everyday life drain emotional energy, time, and opportunities. The longer a dispute continues unnecessarily, the higher its cost becomes. This view encourages smart solutions that preserve resources instead of chasing immediate victories at any price. Over the centuries, the art of war has influenced generals, rulers, entrepreneurs, athletes, and negotiators. Many business schools use its principles to discuss strategy, risk management, and decision-making. In sports, coaches often stress the importance of studying opponents before competition. In politics, campaigns rely on detailed analysis before choosing their actions. Even those who have never read the book have likely encountered ideas inspired by it. Still, perhaps Sun Tzu's most valuable lesson is the reminder that intelligence is not only about winning conflicts. Often, the greatest sign of wisdom is avoiding unnecessary battles altogether. In a world that often rewards those who speak the loudest, react the fastest, or impose their will through force, his philosophy offers a different path. Observe before acting, understand before judging, and plan before confronting any challenge. This vision remains powerful because it shifts attention from force to strategy. The side with more resources, power, or influence does not always win. In many cases, success depends more on correctly reading reality than on showing superiority. That may be why the art of war remains relevant after so many centuries. It does not only teach how to face opponents. Above all, it teaches how to develop clarity, discipline, and intelligence in the face of life's inevitable conflicts, without turning every relationship into a battlefield, but understanding that every important decision requires preparation, balance, and long-term vision. You probably believe you make dozens of decisions on your own every day. You choose how to dress, how to speak, what to post on social media, how to behave at work, and even how to express your opinions. But what if many of these choices are influenced by control systems so subtle that you almost never notice them? This is one of the most unsettling questions raised by Michel Foucault. In his book, Discipline and Punish, he proposes a radical shift in how we understand power. Instead of seeing it only in the hands of presidents, kings, or governments, Foucault argues that power is spread throughout society, present in institutions, habits, language, and even everyday routines. Traditionally, power was seen as something concentrated in a central authority. A ruler created laws, enforced punishments, and controlled the population. Foucault does not deny that this kind of power exists, but he argues it is only part of the picture. According to him, the most effective forms of control do not rely only on force or violence. They work in a quieter way, shaping how we think, feel, and act, often without us realizing it. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault begins with a striking contrast. In earlier centuries, punishments were extremely public and violent. Executions took place in front of crowds, and the suffering of the condemned served as a display of state power. Over time, however, these practices began to disappear. Prisons replaced public spectacles, and punishment moved out of sight. At first glance, this seems like a humanitarian improvement. But Foucault asks a provocative question. Did power really become more humane, or did it simply become more efficient and subtle? His answer is surprising. For him, society stopped focusing only on punishing crimes and began to invest more in producing disciplined individuals. Instead of reacting after someone breaks the rules, institutions try to shape behavior from an early age. Schools organize schedules, line up students, and measure performance. Military systems train obedience and discipline. Hospitals classify bodies and behaviors. Companies monitor productivity. Prisons refine surveillance systems. All of these institutions help form individuals who learn to regulate themselves. This process is called disciplinary power. Unlike open violence, it works continuously and almost invisibly. There does not need to be a guard watching every movement at all times. It is enough that people believe they might be watched for them to adjust their behavior. Over time, external surveillance turns into self-surveillance. To explain this idea, Foucault uses an architectural design by Jeremy Bentham called the panopticon. It is a circular prison with a central tower where a single guard can observe all cells. The key point is that prisoners never know exactly when they are being watched. Because of this uncertainty, they behave as if they are always under observation. Although the panopticon was designed as a prison model, Foucault argues that its logic spread throughout modern society. Many systems work in similar ways today. Security cameras, constant evaluations, performance tracking, monitoring systems, and behavioral rules create environments where people learn to watch themselves. Control no longer depends only on force. It works through internalized discipline. This is what makes his philosophy so unsettling. If we grow up learning what is considered acceptable behavior, how free are our choices really? How many actions come from genuine desire, and how many come from fear of judgment, exclusion, or punishment? For Foucault, these questions do not have simple answers because power operates in very subtle ways. Another key idea in his thinking is the relationship between power and knowledge. According to Foucault, the two are always connected. Every society produces forms of knowledge that help organize and classify people. Medicine defines what is considered healthy or sick. Psychology sets standards for behavior. Education establishes learning expectations. Law separates what is allowed from what is forbidden. These classifications are not necessarily false or malicious, but they also play a role in shaping power relations within society. This does not mean Foucault rejected science or institutions. His goal was to show that no system of knowledge is completely neutral. Whenever we classify people, set standards, or define norms, we also shape ways of living. Knowledge does not just describe the world, it helps construct it. This insight becomes even more relevant in the digital age. Social networks track preferences, algorithms recommend content, platforms monitor behavior, and smart devices collect data constantly. Although Foucault died before the internet became widespread, many scholars see his ideas as highly relevant to today's world of digital surveillance. Much of modern monitoring is carried out not only by governments, but also by technology companies, apps, and automated systems. However, it would be a mistake to see Foucault as simply saying that power is bad. This is one of the most common misunderstandings of his work. For him, power does not only repress, it also produces knowledge, organizes institutions, creates identities, and makes social life possible. No society exists without power relations. The issue arises when these relations stop being questioned and start to feel natural or unavoidable. For this reason, Foucault studied how certain practices developed throughout history. Many rules we now consider normal did not always exist. Forms of education, punishment, medicine, and work organization were created in specific historical contexts and could have developed differently. Understanding this history shows that what seems permanent is actually the result of human decisions. His influence extends across sociology, education, psychology, law, political science, communication, and cultural studies. Researchers use his ideas to analyze digital surveillance, institutional control, social inequality, knowledge production, and identity formation. Even decades after his death, his work continues to spark debate around the world. Perhaps Foucault's most important contribution is showing that power rarely appears in obvious ways. It often works through small rules, social expectations, evaluations, and everyday mechanisms. The more effective it becomes, the less it needs force. This changes how we understand freedom itself. Instead of only asking who is in charge of society, Foucault invites us to look at how behavior is shaped, how norms are created, and how our everyday choices are influenced. After seeing the world this way, it becomes almost impossible to look at it the same again. If power truly exists in all areas of social life, then freedom may not only depend on removing obvious oppression, but also on becoming aware of the subtle systems that shape how we think, act, and even see ourselves. This shift in perspective is what makes Discipline and Punish one of the most influential works in modern philosophy. Long before Machiavelli wrote The Prince, an Indian strategist had already developed one of the most detailed political treatises of the ancient world. His name was Chanakya, also known as Kautilya or Vishnugupta. While many philosophers focused on what an ideal ruler should be, Chanakya was concerned with something far more practical: how to prevent a kingdom from being destroyed by external enemies, internal betrayal, and naive decisions. His answer became the Arthashastra, a work covering public administration, economics, diplomacy, intelligence, espionage, and military strategy. Even today, it is considered one of the most sophisticated political texts ever written. To understand his thinking, it is important to consider the context in which he lived. India in the 4th century BCE was made up of many competing kingdoms fighting for land, wealth, and influence. Conspiracies, shifting alliances, and invasions were part of everyday political life. In this environment, an overly idealistic ruler would have struggled to survive for long. Chanakya believed that the survival of the state required a realistic understanding of human nature and international relations. Unlike thinkers who placed morality at the center of politics, Chanakya argued that a ruler's main responsibility is to protect the people and preserve the stability of the kingdom. If difficult decisions were necessary to prevent war, invasion, or collapse, they had to be taken seriously. For him, a leader who failed to act in the face of danger risked not only his own position, but the safety of thousands of people. This approach is often described as political pragmatism. Instead of asking only what is morally ideal, Chanakya asked what actually works in real conditions. This does not mean he ignored ethics entirely. The Arthashastra also promotes justice in administration, protection of the population, encouragement of trade, and the fight against corruption. However, when the survival of the state was at risk, pragmatic decisions had to come before idealism. One of the most well-known aspects of his philosophy is his support for espionage. For Chanakya, ruling without reliable information was like walking through a dark forest without knowing where the dangers are. A king needed to understand not only external enemies, but also possible conspiracies within his own government. For this reason, he recommended building a wide network of agents to observe events, verify rumors, and provide strategic intelligence before problems turned into crisis. Today, the word espionage often brings to mind spy movies or international covert operations. For Chanakya, however, it was mainly a tool of prevention. A well-informed ruler could stop conflicts before they escalated, detect threats early, and make decisions based on facts rather than assumptions. Information was treated as a resource as valuable as armies or wealth. Another key element of the Arthashastra is its view of political alliances. Chanakya observed that friendships between states are rarely permanent. International relations shift depending on interests, economic conditions, and the balance of power. For this reason, he advised rulers to carefully analyze each agreement and avoid blindly trusting promises or declarations of goodwill. Alliances were important, but they needed constant evaluation and caution. This reflects a highly realistic understanding of politics. Chanakya did not assume that everyone is dishonest, but he considered it dangerous to base major decisions only on trust. A wise leader had to consider different scenarios, prepare alternatives, and be ready to respond if allies changed their position. In a competitive world of states, naivety could be extremely costly. His philosophy also gives major importance to economics. For Chanakya, no kingdom could remain independent without strong financial resources. A weak state would struggle to defend its borders, support its army, or meet the needs of its population. Because of this, large sections of the Arthashastra focus on taxation, trade, public finance, and anti-corruption measures. Economic strength was not just about prosperity. It was essential for political stability. Another notable aspect of his work is his concern with advisors. Chanakya warned that rulers often fail, not because they lack intelligence, but because they surround themselves with people who only tell them what they want to hear. A good king must listen to different opinions, carefully evaluate information, and be cautious of both excessive praise and rushed decisions. The quality of a ruler's advisors directly affects the fate of the entire kingdom. This insight still feels very relevant today. In any organization, whether a government, company, or institution, important decisions depend heavily on the quality of information and the ability to consider different perspectives. Leaders surrounded only by agreement tend to make increasingly larger mistakes because they lose sight of risks that could have been identified earlier. However, perhaps no part of Chanakya's thought has sparked more debate than his willingness to accept morally difficult measures when he believed the interests of the state were at risk. In certain situations, the Arthashastra allows covert operations, strategic misinformation, and discreet actions to neutralize threats. These ideas have often led scholars to compare him to Machiavelli, even though Chanakya lived nearly 2,000 years earlier. This similarity, however, should not hide an important difference. Chanakya places strong emphasis on the well-being of the population. He repeatedly states that the prosperity of the ruler depends on the prosperity of the people. A kingdom where citizens suffer greatly cannot remain stable for long. In this sense, protecting the state also meant protecting its economic and social foundation. Even so, his ideas raise a difficult question that remains relevant today. How far can a government go to protect its country? Are there limits that should never be crossed, even in times of great threat? Or do some situations truly require actions that would be unacceptable in peacetime? These questions remain central in debates about national security, intelligence, diplomacy, and international relations. Chanakya's influence has lasted for centuries and continues to shape studies in political science, public administration, and strategy. Many scholars consider him one of the earliest major thinkers of state management, precisely because he combined economics, diplomacy, security, administration, and leadership into a single system of thought. His legacy shows that governing requires much more than good intentions. It demands planning, information, adaptability, and long-term vision. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Arthashastra is that politics rarely takes place in ideal conditions. Leaders must often make decisions in uncertainty, balancing risks, interests, and consequences that affect millions of people. Chanakya does not offer comfortable answers or rely on abstract principles alone. His philosophy is challenging because it forces us to recognize that protecting a society often requires more than courage or honesty. It also requires judgment, knowing when to trust, when to negotiate, when to step back, and when to act decisively. This combination of realism and strategy is what makes Chanakya one of the most influential and controversial political thinkers in history. In a world where resting almost feels like a sin and being busy all the time has become a sign of value, an uncomfortable question comes up. What if no one needs to force us to work so much anymore, because we already do it to ourselves? This is exactly where Byung-Chul Han's thinking becomes unsettling. In the Burnout Society, he describes a silent shift in how power works in modern life. We are no longer controlled only by outside orders, but by a constant inner pressure to perform, produce, and succeed. To explain this idea, Han makes an important distinction between two types of society. In the past, he says, we lived in a disciplinary society, a concept also described by thinkers like Michel Foucault. In that system, control came from the outside: strict rules, direct surveillance, clear punishments, and institutions that limited behavior. Today, however, we have moved into a different kind of social system, more subtle, but also more efficient: the performance society. In this new model, we are no longer just obedient. We become entrepreneurs of ourselves. Instead of someone constantly telling us what to do, we internalize the logic of productivity and start demanding more results, more efficiency, and more performance from ourselves. The main feeling is no longer fear of external punishment, but guilt for not doing enough. Han points out that this creates a powerful illusion of freedom. After all, no one is literally forcing us to work beyond our limits, study nonstop, or always be available. On the contrary, modern culture tells us we can be anything we want as long as we try hard enough. The problem is that this freedom comes with invisible pressure. If everything depends on us, then every failure also becomes entirely our responsibility. This is where one of the central ideas of the Burnout Society appears. Exploitation is no longer only external, but internal. In other words, there doesn't need to be an oppressive boss demanding constant work. We become that boss ourselves. The modern individual is not only exploited, they also willingly exploit themselves, believing they are chasing personal success. This logic produces a very specific kind of suffering. Instead of a society based on limits and prohibitions, we live in a society of unlimited possibilities. You can do anything becomes the dominant message. But the more possibilities there are, the stronger the feeling of not being enough. There is always something more to do, learn, or achieve. The result is a constant state of restlessness. Han connects this to the rise of modern mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and burnout. For him, these are not just individual problems, but structural symptoms of a society that turns the person into an endless self-improvement project. People don't just feel tired. They feel inadequate, like they are never meeting their own expectations. An important part of his analysis is how power itself has changed. In the past, control was visible and external. Now it becomes invisible and psychological. We don't need to be watched all the time, because we already watch ourselves. External surveillance turns into constant self-surveillance. Instead of being forced to produce, we feel like we must always produce. This shift also deeply changes our relationship with time. Rest, which used to be a natural part of life, starts to feel like wasted productivity. Even leisure time often gets filled with useful activities: courses, productive reading, side projects, personal improvement. Even rest needs justification. Simply doing nothing starts to feel uncomfortable. Han argues that this constant pressure creates exhausted but hyperactive individuals. People do many things at once, but rarely feel real satisfaction. The tiredness does not only come from physical work, but from overload of stimulation, expectations, and self-pressure. It is exhaustion that cannot be solved just by sleeping more, because its source is not only physical, but existential. Another key point in his philosophy is the criticism of excessive positivity. Modern society promotes constant motivational messages. You can do it. Just try harder. Never give up. Be your best self. While these may sound inspiring, Hahn argues they can become a subtle form of pressure. When everything must be positive and productive, there is no space left for limits, failure, or real rest. This constant demand for positivity removes the ability to accept vulnerability. People feel forced to turn every difficulty into an opportunity for growth. But this mindset can become exhausting because it does not allow you to simply stop, feel, or rest without guilt. Even suffering is expected to be useful. In contrast, Hahn values silence, pause, and contemplation. He suggests that human beings need spaces of non-production moments where there is no demand to perform. Leisure in this sense is not laziness, but resistance. It is in silence and interruption of constant productivity that people can reconnect with themselves in a more authentic way. Digital society makes this even stronger. Social media turns life into a constant performance display. People show achievements, routines, bodies, trips, and personal projects as a form of validation. Every post becomes a small competition for attention, recognition, and approval. Slowly, life itself becomes shaped by the need to be seen and validated. Hahn notes that even rest becomes performative in this environment. It is not enough to rest. You have to show that you are resting in a productive way through aesthetic experiences, travel, or carefully curated lifestyles. The line between living and performing life becomes increasingly blurred. Even though his diagnosis is critical, Byung-Chul Han's thinking is not purely pessimistic. It also opens space for reflection on other ways of living. Instead of a life based only on performance and speed, he suggests recovering slowness, deep attention, and the ability to simply exist without constantly justifying yourself. This change does not require completely leaving society, but changing how we relate to its demands. Recognizing patterns of self-exploitation is already a first step toward not being fully absorbed by them. Realizing that not all productivity equals value can open space for a less exhausting life. In the end, the central message of the burnout society is simple but uncomfortable. Perhaps the biggest prison today is not the one imposed from the outside, but the one we build inside ourselves when we believe we are never doing enough. And as long as this logic stays invisible, we will keep confusing exhaustion with freedom, without noticing that we are often at the same time the worker, the supervisor, and the boss of ourselves. There are thoughts that do not comfort, do not soothe, and do not offer any way out. On the contrary, they seem to strip away every layer of protection we use to make existence bearable. Emil Cioran belongs exactly to this kind of thinking. In works like A Short History of Decay and The Trouble with Being Born, he does not try to build a philosophical system or offer final answers. His writing is fragmented, sharp, and deeply suspicious of any form of organized hope. For him, thinking clearly is not a path to peace, but a direct confrontation with the discomfort of simply existing. Cioran starts from a realization that runs through all his work. Being born is already a problem in itself, not as a specific tragedy or a particular circumstance, but as a universal condition. In his view, the simple fact of existing already places us in a situation of unavoidable loss. Before we even want anything, we are already thrown into a world we did not choose, carrying needs, limits, and frustrations we never asked for. This makes existence feel, from the very beginning, like something slightly out of balance. Unlike other thinkers who try to find meaning in suffering or turn it into a lesson, Cioran rejects this idea almost completely. He does not believe pain necessarily leads to growth, or that life has some hidden purpose. For him, suffering is not a step toward something higher, but a constant feature of life. And any attempt to justify it may actually make it harder to bear, because it adds expectations to something that simply happens. In The Trouble with Being Born, this view appears even more directly. Choran writes like someone observing life without any comforting filters. Instead of searching for explanations for suffering, he treats it as unavoidable, almost structural. Consciousness, in this context, is not a gift but a burden. Knowing too much, noticing too much, and thinking too much can become a kind of silent torment. Clarity, instead of freeing us, exposes what many people prefer not to see. This is one of the central tensions in his philosophy. The more aware a person becomes of reality, the harder it is to feel at ease within it. Ignorance, in this sense, is not just a lack of knowledge, but also a form of emotional protection. Choran suggests that many of the structures that give life meaning, beliefs, ideologies, hopes for the future, function like anesthesia against the weight of existence. When those layers are removed, what remains is the raw fact of being alive. In A Short History of Decay, this perspective appears in a style made of short fragments, almost like interrupted thoughts. There is no linear argument, but rather a series of reflections that break away from traditional systematic philosophy. Instead of organizing the world, Choran seems to dismantle it, revealing its instability. His writing does not aim to convince, but to expose states of consciousness. One of the most striking aspects of his work is his relationship with time. For Choran, the past offers no comfort and the future guarantees no redemption. The present is filled with a mind that never fully rests. Time is not a path of progress, but a flow that only confirms how temporary everything is. Nothing lasts, and this impermanence is not presented as poetic or liberating, but as a constant source of unease. This places him close to an extreme form of philosophical disillusionment, but not in the simple emotional sense of pessimism. Choran does not write to complain about life, but to observe what remains when all illusions are stripped away. He positions himself as a witness to the impossibility of finding fully satisfying justifications for existence. And this is exactly where his philosophy becomes uncomfortable. It offers no alternative. Across his texts, there is also a reflection on thinking itself. Thinking, for Choran, is not necessarily neutral or positive. In many cases, excessive thought deepens discomfort. While some philosophies see reflection as a path to clarity and freedom, he suggests it can also intensify the awareness of meaninglessness. The more one thinks, the harder it becomes to ignore what disturbs them. This excess of clarity creates a constant inner tension. A person begins to see contradictions everywhere, including in their own attempts to find emotional or intellectual stability. Nothing feels solid enough to support a final belief. Even hope, when examined closely, can appear fragile in the face of life's unpredictability. Still, Choran does not present his philosophy as a call to total despair. There is a bitter irony in his writing, almost an aesthetic awareness of discomfort itself. At times, he turns suffering into language, as if the only way to endure existence is to translate it into thought. Writing does not solve the problem, but it creates a small distance between the person and what feels unbearable. Another important point is his refusal to embrace ideological systems or total explanations. Choran deeply distrusts any discourse that claims to offer final answers about the human condition. For him, philosophical, religious, or political systems often try to organize what is essentially chaotic. This organization may bring comfort, but it can also hide the complexity of existence. This places him in a unique position in modern philosophy. He does not offer a way out, but he also does not fit into a simple label of pure negativity. His work functions more like an uncomfortable mirror than a guide. Reading Choran often means confronting thoughts we avoid forming, but that appear when all distractions are removed. The reception of his work has always been marked by this ambiguity. Some readers see him as a philosopher of despair, while others interpret him as someone who exposes, with radical honesty, what is often hidden by optimistic discourse. In both cases, his writing creates a kind of mental slowdown, as if it becomes impossible to think in the same way after encountering his ideas. Sioran's thought does not aim to close questions or provide comfort. It remains in the space of doubt, contradiction, and sharp awareness of human fragility. His philosophy does not point to a solution, but to a condition, that existing, thinking, and perceiving the world can be both unavoidable and deeply uncomfortable. And it may be precisely in this unresolved tension that his work finds its lasting force, reminding us that not all knowledge leads to peace, and that, in some cases, understanding too much is exactly what makes everything harder to bear. Each thinker presented here offers a different way of seeing the world, some more comfortable, others unsettling, but all capable of expanding how we understand life, power, suffering, and existence itself. If you've followed along until here, thank you for your time and attention. Content like this only makes sense when someone on the other side is willing to reflect along with it. If this video made you think, leave a like, because it helps the channel reach more people who also enjoy philosophical and reflective content like this. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there are always new videos here, exploring ideas that help us see the world in a different way. Share this video with someone who enjoys philosophy or this kind of reflective content. It really helps the channel grow. And now I want to hear from you. Which of these philosophies impacted you the most, or made you the most uncomfortable? Write it in the comments. I'll read them carefully. Stay on the channel and watch the next videos, because this journey isn't over yet. There are many more powerful ideas coming soon.